Good evening, and welcome back to Drowsy History. Tonight, we are going to drift slowly and gently across 3 centuries of one of the most remarkable transformations the world has ever known. A long, unhurried passage from the candlelit quiet of the Middle Ages into the dawn of the modern world. There is nothing here you need to remember, nothing you need to follow closely. You can simply let the words carry you, the way a slow river carries a leaf, turning it gently, taking it somewhere far away while you rest. Before we begin, if you find these journeys soothing, you might take a quiet moment to like this video and to subscribe to the channel. Only if it genuinely helps you drift off. Only if you'd like more stories like this waiting for you on the nights ahead. It's a small thing, and it lets me keep making these for you. And as always, I'd love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Whenever you feel like it, leave your town and your local time in the comments below. There is something lovely in picturing this same calm story unfolding in so many different rooms, in so many different corners of the world, all of us settling in together. So make yourself comfortable. Let your shoulders soften. Let the day you've had loosen its grip, just a little, with each slow breath. If it helps, turn down the lights and let a soft sound fill the room. A fan, the hush of rain, the low hum of the night. We have all the time in the world, and nowhere to be but here. Tonight, let your mind travel back to Europe around the year 1300. Imagine a continent of stone and field and forest, of walled towns and quiet monasteries, where most people lived their whole lives within a day's walk of where they were born. Picture the bells of a country church drifting over the fields, narrow streets, the smell of wood smoke and bread, candle flames trembling behind shutters. This is the world before the Renaissance. A world that did not yet know it was about to change. And over the next 300 years, slowly and almost without anyone noticing, a new way of seeing the world would begin to grow, like spring coming on so gradually that no single morning marks its arrival. We'll wander through that world together, through the streets of Florence, into the workshops of painters, out to harbors where ships set sail toward unknown seas. And through it all, the pace will stay slow, the voice soft, the journey gentle. So let's begin, easing into the story the way you might ease into a warm bath at the end of a long day, and let yourself grow drowsier with every step. Chapter 1. The End of the Middle Ages. To understand how something new began, we first have to rest a while in the world that came before it. Picture Europe in the years around 1300, a continent shaped above all by the rhythms of the land and the authority of the church. Most people were farmers, living in small villages, their lives turning with the seasons, planting in spring, harvesting in late summer, waiting through the long, dark winters. The day was measured not by clocks, but by the ringing of church bells, by sunrise and sunset, by the slow procession of feast days through the year. Above this quiet rural world stood 2 great pillars. One was the feudal order, a web of obligation that bound peasant to lord and lord to king. The other was the church, which held not only spiritual authority, but a profound grip on the imagination, framing how people understood birth and death, sin and grace, the shape of the cosmos itself. Knowledge moved slowly. Books were rare and precious, copied out by hand over many months by monks bent over their desks, and to own even a few was a mark of real wealth. And yet, the High Middle Ages had not been empty of learning. Europe had built its first universities in Bologna, in Paris, in Oxford, where scholars studied law, medicine, and above all, theology. They knew the ancient world of Greece and Rome, but tended to read its authors through a particular lens, valuing them most where they supported Christian teaching and often knew the texts only in fragments, copied and recopied until errors crept quietly into the lines. Beneath the apparent stability, though, the ground was already shifting. Trade was reawakening across the Mediterranean, and towns were swelling with new life. In the cities of northern Italy, merchants were growing rich not from owning land, as the old nobility did, but from commerce and finance, from networks of credit that reached from the wool markets of England to the spice routes of the East. A new kind of person was emerging. The merchant, the banker, ambitious and literate, no longer content to accept the place assigned by birth. The Crusades, too, had left their mark, widening Europe's horizons and drawing unfamiliar goods and ideas back toward the West, including, quietly, the preserved writings of the ancient world, kept alive by Arab and Byzantine scholars while much of Europe had half forgotten them. And then came the catastrophe that would shake this world to its foundations. In the autumn of 1347, ships arrived in the ports of southern Europe, carrying a terror no one was prepared for. It reached Sicily first, then Genoa and Venice and Pisa, and from there spread with terrible speed across the whole continent. We know it now as the Black Death. Within a few years, it may have killed something like a third of the people of Europe, and in some crowded cities the toll was higher still. The Florentine writer Boccaccio, who lived through it, described the dead carried out by the hundreds and laid in great trenches, layer upon layer. Whole villages emptied, and the familiar rhythms of life simply broke apart. The plague did not by itself create the Renaissance. Historians are careful to remind us of that. It struck all of Europe, not only Italy, and brought far more grief than glory. But it did unsettle the old order. With so many dead, those who survived found their labor had suddenly become precious. In much of northern Italy, wages rose, the last threads of serfdom began to loosen, and the rigid hierarchy that had held people in place for generations began, ever so slightly, to soften. It is one theory, much discussed and never fully settled, that the new familiarity with death also helped tilt the European mind just a little toward the here and now. Whatever the whole truth, the old certainty had been disturbed, and into that disturbance, slowly, a new spirit would begin to grow. So this is where we begin, in a world grown quieter after great loss, where the old structures still stood but no longer felt quite so unshakable, and where, here and there, a few minds were beginning to turn toward the ancient past with a strange new longing. Let that picture settle softly, the emptied villages slowly refilling, the bells still ringing over the fields, and beneath it all, something new beginning to wake. Chapter 2. Rich Italy. If the Renaissance had a cradle, it rocked first in Italy, and to understand why, we have to picture the peculiar shape of the Italian world. Most of Europe was organizing itself into large kingdoms ruled by kings. Italy was different. It was a patchwork, a scattering of independent city-states, proud republics and duchies, each with its own government and character, each in fierce rivalry with its neighbors. There was no single Italian king. Instead, there was Florence and Venice, Milan and Genoa, Rome and Naples, each a world unto itself, each competing for wealth and beauty and renown. This very fragmentation, strange as it seems, helped light the spark. The cities were intensely competitive, and that competition spilled into the arts. A city that could boast a grander cathedral or a more celebrated painter gained prestige over its rivals, and civic pride became a kind of fuel. And because many of these cities were republics, not democracies as we would know them, but states with councils and elected offices and a real sense of citizenship, they prized a certain freedom of mind, with room for ambition and individual achievement. And the cities were rich. Italy sat at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade, the gateway through which the goods of the East flowed into Europe. Venice grew fabulously wealthy as a trading hub, her workshops turning out fine glass prized across the continent. Florence built her fortune on wool and cloth. Wealth on this scale meant there was money to spare for great building projects, for art, and time, that rare and precious thing, for study and reflection. Let us linger in Florence, for it will be at the heart of our story. Picture a city of perhaps 100,000 souls before the plague, set in the green valley of the Arno, ringed by walls and crowded with towers. The guilds, the associations of merchants and craftsmen, of wool workers and goldsmiths, held real power, funding great public works and sponsoring the decoration of churches. Political life was turbulent and often violent, power passing among rival families, yet also unusually broad, with more citizens involved in governance than in most kingdoms of the age. And in the midst of this lively, quarrelsome city, one family would rise to extraordinary influence, one whose name has become almost a synonym for the Renaissance itself: the Medici. They began not as nobles or warriors, but in the rural Mugello region of Tuscany, making their fortune through a quieter kind of power: banking. In 1397, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici established a bank in Florence, and through careful, patient dealing, the Medici Bank grew into the largest in Europe. Its great advantage, the business it handled for the papacy, managing the finances of the church itself, which brought both immense profit and immense prestige. Giovanni's son, Cosimo de' Medici, later honored as Cosimo the Elder, turned this inheritance into something more lasting than money. Cosimo understood a subtle truth, that to grasp too openly at power in a republic was to invite ruin. Florence remained in name a republic, and so Cosimo ruled, in effect, from behind the curtain, rarely holding office, working instead through alliances and, above all, through patronage, funding churches and libraries, supporting scholars and artists, making himself the great benefactor of the city. His generosity bought loyalty, and loyalty translated almost invisibly into power. A pope of the time is said to have remarked that Cosimo was king of Florence in everything but name. And when he died in 1464, the grateful city gave him the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, an honor once given to Cicero in ancient Rome. We'll meet the Medici again, especially Cosimo's brilliant grandson Lorenzo, who would gather young artists around him like a gardener tending rare flowers. But for now, let this picture settle as you drift. The rich Italian cities glittering with trade, Florence in her green valley, and the quiet banker who learned that the surest way to be powerful was to make himself beloved. Chapter 3. The Rediscovery of Antiquity. Now we come to the heart of what made the Renaissance, the rebirth that gives the whole age its name. And that rebirth at its core was an act of remembering. It was the rediscovery of the ancient world. The civilizations of Greece and Rome had never been entirely forgotten. Their shadow lay everywhere, in the broken columns scattered through the countryside, in the ruins of Rome itself, in the Latin scholars still wrote. But much of the actual writing of the ancient world, the poetry, the history, the philosophy, the letters in which long-dead voices spoke most humanly, had slipped into shadow, lying forgotten on the shelves of remote monasteries, unread for centuries. The knowledge was there, but it was sleeping. And so a small number of passionate scholars set themselves a quiet, almost loving task, to seek out these forgotten texts, to copy and study them and bring them back into the light. They traveled across Europe, searching monastery libraries the way a treasure seeker hunts for buried gold, correcting the errors that generations of weary copyists had introduced. And they read the ancient authors not merely as authorities to be quoted in support of doctrine, but as living voices, companions across the centuries, speaking of love and loss, of duty and friendship, of how a person ought to live. Among these early hunters were Coluccio Salutati, the Chancellor of Florence, and Poggio Bracciolini, who roamed the monastic libraries and brought to light lost works of Latin literature that might otherwise have perished entirely. There was a particular thrill in this work, a sense of rescue, of carrying some water-stained, fragile manuscript out into the daylight, knowing that you were the bridge by which an ancient mind would speak again. This was not dry scholarship. It was an act of devotion, almost of resurrection. Then, in the middle of the 15th century, a great current joined the stream from the east. In 1453, the ancient city of Constantinople, the last surviving heart of the old Roman Empire in its Greek Byzantine form, fell to the Ottoman Turks, and Greek scholars fled westward, many to Italy, carrying their precious manuscripts and their deep knowledge of the Greek language. For centuries, Western Europe had known the Greek philosophers mostly at second hand. Now the original texts themselves were flowing in. Plato, in particular, long overshadowed in the medieval schools by Aristotle, found new and eager readers, and in Florence, under the warm patronage of the Medici, a circle of scholars led by Marsilio Ficino gathered to study him afresh. So picture this gentle, patient labor spreading across the cities of Italy. The candlelit desks, the careful pens, a whole civilization's memory being slowly restored, page by page, and with it a sense that human beings had once reached heights of wisdom that might be reached again. Let that quiet, hopeful feeling settle over you now, like the soft light of a reading lamp in a darkened room. Chapter 4: Humanism. Out of this rediscovery grew an idea, really a whole new attitude toward life, that we call humanism. It is a word that can sound abstract, but at its heart it was something warm and simple. The humanists believed that the study of the great works of antiquity, its history, poetry, philosophy, and eloquence, could make a person wiser, better, more fully alive. They believed in the dignity and the potential of the human being, and they turned their attention, with new intensity, to human experience itself, to what made a life noble, to the cultivation of virtue, to the art of living well. It is important to be clear about what humanism was not. For most of these thinkers, it was not a rejection of religion. The great majority remained devout Christians, seeing no conflict between honoring God and celebrating the gifts, intellect, creativity, the moral capacity that they believed God had given to humankind. What changed was the emphasis. Alongside the contemplation of heaven, there was now a renewed attention to the world below, to the here and now, and people began, gently, to see themselves a little differently, not only as souls awaiting the next life, but as actors in this one, capable of shaping their own destinies. The figure usually placed at the fountainhead of all this is Francesco Petrarca, known to us as Petrarch, born in 1304 in the Tuscan town of Arezzo, and raised largely around Avignon, where the papal court had moved. Often called the father of humanism, he earned the title partly through his poetry. His sonnets would be admired across Europe for centuries, but above all through his passionate love of the ancient world. Wherever he traveled, he searched for crumbling old manuscripts. He loved Cicero above all, and in 1345, in the Cathedral Library of Verona, he made a discovery that thrilled the scholarly world. A collection of Cicero's private letters, lost for centuries. Not grand public speeches, but intimate correspondence, full of the small worries and warm affections of a real life. Reading them, Petrarch felt he had met the man himself, and was so moved that he wrote letters back to Cicero, a man 1400 years dead, as though to a living friend. To Petrarch, the past was not a closed door. It was a conversation waiting to be resumed. There was a melancholy in him, too. He looked back at the glory of ancient Rome and felt keenly how far his own age seemed to have fallen from it. He is often credited with inventing the very idea of a dark age, lying between the brilliance of antiquity and the hoped-for renewal of his own day. This longing, this sense of a greatness lost and waiting to be recovered, lay close to the heart of the whole movement. To study the ancients was to insist that beauty and wisdom had existed once, and could exist again. From these beginnings, humanism transformed education above all. The humanists devised a new course of study built around grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy, learned through the close reading of the classical authors. The aim was not merely to fill the mind with facts, but to form the whole person, to think clearly, to speak and write persuasively, to reason about right and wrong, to take one's place as a thoughtful citizen. This idea would shape European schooling for centuries, and its echoes are still with us today. So picture this new spirit spreading from city to city, from scholar to scholar, like warmth through a cold house when the first fire is lit. People beginning to believe that a human life, well-lived and well-examined, was a thing of real dignity and worth. Let that gentle confidence settle over you and rest in it a while. Chapter 5. Daily Life in Florence. Before we go further into great artists and grand ideas, let us slow down and walk for a while through the everyday life of a Renaissance city, lived day by bakers and weavers, by mothers and apprentices, by merchants closing their ledgers in the evening light. Let us spend a quiet hour imagining an ordinary day in Florence, and let its small, familiar textures lull you towards sleep. The day begins early before the sun. In the gray light before dawn, the bakers are already at work, and the smell of fresh bread drifts through the narrow streets, mingling with the smoke of hearth fires being coaxed back to life. Shutters open, merchants arrange their goods beneath wooden awnings, and slowly the city wakes to the ordinary music of a working morning. Footsteps, voices, the creak of carts, the call of a vendor. Most meals were built around bread with olive oil in place of the butter of the colder north, and beans, onions, cabbage, and whatever vegetables the season provided. Meat was a rarer pleasure for ordinary families. The wealthy ate more richly, with game and spices carried from far away. Wine accompanied nearly every meal, often watered down, partly because clean water could not always be trusted in a crowded city. Walk a little further and you come upon the markets and workshops, the beating heart of the city's working life, where the guilds held sway and a person's trade shaped their whole identity. Clothing told you, at a glance, where someone stood. There were even laws regulating what fabrics and colors different ranks could wear. Silk and bright dyes marked out the wealthy, while wool was the everyday cloth of the artisan. The richest families lived in grand stone houses, palazzi, built around central courtyards, but most city dwellers lived more simply in smaller rooms above the shops, where a single space might serve at once for sleeping and cooking and working. After sunset, light came from candles and oil lamps, small and golden and flickering. The streets grew quiet, and the city gates were closed at certain hours. Family life lay at the center of everything, bound tightly to business and property. Marriages were carefully arranged, with dowries negotiated like contracts, and once married, a woman managed the household and very often played a real part in the family trade. Childhood for a boy often pointed toward apprenticeship. A boy of 12 or so might enter a master's workshop, living in the master's household, learning a trade by years of patient labor. And over all of this lay the rhythm of religion. The church bell still marked the hours and the days. Sundays and feast days broke the routine with processions and music. Faith was not a separate compartment of life. It was woven through all of it, from the blessing over the morning bread to the prayers murmured at the close of day. So picture our ordinary Florentine as the day winds down. The work is finished, the shutters are closing, the smell of an evening meal fills the small rooms. The candles burn low, and the bells ring for the evening. And slowly, all across the city, in grand palazzi and humble rooms alike, people settle down to rest, just as you are settling now. Let the warm, ordinary peace of that vanished evening fold around you and drift. Chapter 6. Giotto and the First Changes in Art. To see how Renaissance art was born, We begin a little before the Renaissance proper, with a painter who lived at the very turn of things, Giotto di Bondone, who worked in the late 13th and early 14th centuries and stands like a doorway between two worlds. To understand what Giotto changed, picture first the art that came before him. Medieval painting was beautiful, but in a particular way, solemn, symbolic, otherworldly. Figures were often flat and stylized, floating against shimmering backgrounds of gold leaf that suggested not earthly space, but the timeless light of heaven, and the size of a figure showed its holiness rather than its distance from the viewer. The aim was not to show the world as the eye sees it, but to point beyond it, toward sacred truths. Giotto began quietly to change all of this. In his frescoes, wall paintings made on fresh plaster, and most famously in a chapel in the northern city of Padua, he gave his figures something they had rarely had before: weight and solidity and feeling. His people stood firmly on the ground, their robes falling in real folds over the real shapes of bodies beneath. It is hard, from our distance, to grasp how startling this must have been. For the first time in many centuries, a painter was trying to show not the eternal and symbolic, but the human and the real. The change did not happen all at once. It would take more than a century and many more hands to unfold fully. But the seed was planted, the idea that art might hold a mirror to the visible world. So let that image rest gently with you. A quiet man with a brush, teaching painted figures for the first time in a long age how to grieve and stand and breathe. Chapter 7, Leonardo da Vinci. Now we come to one of the most extraordinary minds that has ever lived, a man whose name has become almost a byword for genius itself, Leonardo da Vinci. Let us take our time with him, for there is much to wonder at. He was born on the 15th of April in the year 1452 near the small Tuscan town of Vinci, from which his name simply means Leonardo from Vinci. He was the illegitimate son of a notary, and that illegitimacy closed certain doors. He could not attend university as the sons of established families did, and yet this may have set him free. Largely self-taught, he learned by looking, observing the world with an attention so patient and complete that it has rarely been equaled. When he was around 14 or 15, his father apprenticed him to one of Florence's finest workshops, that of Andrea del Verrocchio, where Leonardo learned painting and sculpture and the whole range of practical and mechanical arts. His gift showed early. There is a much-loved story, passed down by the chronicler Giorgio Vasari and treated by historians as more legend than fact, that the young Leonardo painted an angel in a picture by his master so luminous and so alive that Verrocchio, seeing it, resolved never to paint again. We cannot know if it truly happened so, but the angel he added to that baptism of Christ does seem to glow with a tenderness beyond his years. What set Leonardo apart was the union of two things the world usually keeps separate: art and science. To him, they were not separate at all. He saw the forces of nature as elegant, even beautiful, and he wanted to understand them completely. And so he filled notebook after notebook with the overflow of an inexhaustible curiosity, studying how light fell across surfaces and how shadows softened at their edges, dissecting the bodies of the dead to understand the muscles beneath the skin, sketching the swirl of water, the structure of a bird's wing, machines for war and peace, including flying machines centuries ahead of anything that could actually be built. He wrote famously in mirror script, his notes running backward across the page. The simplest explanation is that he was left-handed, and writing this way kept his hand from smudging the ink. For about 17 years, Leonardo lived and worked in Milan in the service of its ruler, Ludovico Sforza. There he produced one of the masterpieces of the age, The Last Supper, painted on the wall of a monastery dining hall. He chose to capture a single charged moment, the instant just after Christ tells his apostles that one of them will betray him. And across the long table, he set off a wave of reaction, each apostle responding in his own way with shock, sorrow, denial, quiet dismay. Leonardo called these visible reactions the motions of the mind, and he arranged the whole scene with a deep, calm order that draws the eye toward the still figure of Christ at the center. Yet the painting carried a sorrow within it from the start. Rather than use the durable fresco technique, Leonardo experimented with painting on the dry wall, and the paint did not bond properly, so that the picture began to flake even within his own lifetime. And then, of course, there is the most famous painting in the world, the Mona Lisa. Leonardo began it around 1503, almost certainly a portrait of a Florentine woman named Lisa, wife of a merchant called Francesco del Giocondo, which is why the Italians know it as La Gioconda. He worked on it on and off for years, carrying it with him, never quite parting with it. Into it, he poured the technique he is most associated with, sfumato, from the Italian word for smoke. There are no hard lines in her face, only light and shadow melting into one another in seamless transitions. And there is that smile, ambiguous, flickering, seeming to shift as you look at it, present one moment and gone the next. In his final years, Leonardo accepted the invitation of the young King of France, Francis I, and settled in a manor house near the royal residence at Amboise. There, an old man now, his right hand weakened, he could still draw and teach and think. He died in France in 1519 at the age of 67, leaving behind only a small handful of finished paintings, but also thousands of pages of drawings and notes, the record of a mind that never stopped asking questions. Let that quiet wonder settle over you. The notebooks open on the table, the candle burning, and a man who simply could not stop looking at the world, trying to understand how everything fit together. Chapter 8. Michelangelo. If Leonardo seems to spread outward in every direction, the next great master seems to drive inward and upward with the concentrated force of a single overwhelming gift, Michelangelo Buonarroti. He was born on the 6th of March, in the year 1475, in the small town of Caprese, near Arezzo, the son of a minor government official. The family soon returned to Florence, the city he would always think of as home. As a boy, he was sent to study grammar, but his heart was set on art, and at 13 he was apprenticed to Domenico Ghirlandaio, who ran one of the largest painting workshops in Florence. His talent was so plain that, the story goes, when Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, Cosimo's brilliant grandson, asked Ghirlandaio for his finest pupils, Michelangelo was among those sent. And so he came into the orbit of the Medici, studying the family's collection of ancient sculpture in their garden, drinking in the forms of the classical past, with Lorenzo himself taking a fond interest in the gifted boy. Above all else, Michelangelo thought of himself as a sculptor. He believed, with an almost mystical intensity, that a figure already lay waiting inside the block of marble and that his task was simply to free it. His first great triumph came in Rome while he was still in his 20s, the Pietà, showing the Virgin Mary cradling the body of her dead son across her lap. From a single block of marble, he drew two figures of astonishing tenderness, the young mother's grief held in a stillness so deep it seems almost beyond sorrow, and it is hard to believe such softness was wrung from hard stone. Then he returned to Florence, and there, between 1501 and 1504, he created the work that would become a symbol of the city and of the whole age, the David. He carved it from a single enormous block of marble that other sculptors had abandoned as flawed. Standing some 17 feet tall, far larger than life, the figure shows the young David of the Bible not in triumph after slaying the giant, but in the tense moment before. The sling over his shoulder, a stone in his hand, his brow faintly furrowed, his whole body gathered in a poised, watchful stillness. By tradition, a committee of the city's most distinguished citizens, including Leonardo himself, gathered to decide where to place it, and they set it at the entrance to the seat of Florentine government, where it stood as a proud emblem of the Republic for centuries. But the work for which Michelangelo is most widely known today is one he never wanted to do at all. In 1508, Pope Julius II, a forceful pope sometimes called the Warrior Pope, set him to painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the most sacred space in the Vatican. Michelangelo resisted. He was a sculptor, he protested, not a painter. But the Pope prevailed, and for roughly 4 years he labored on that vast ceiling, not lying on his back, as the popular image has it, but standing on a great wooden scaffold of his own design, reaching upward, craning his neck. The original plan had been modest, merely the 12 apostles. But Michelangelo, once committed, dreamed far larger, and what he created was one of the supreme achievements of human art, a sweeping vision drawn from the book of Genesis, ringed by prophets and sibyls, hundreds of figures in all. At its heart is perhaps the most recognized image in all of Western art, the creation of Adam, in which God reaches across a narrow gap to give life to the first man, their fingers almost, but not quite, touching. Michelangelo lived an extraordinarily long life for his age. He returned to the Sistine Chapel decades later to paint the immense Last Judgment. He took up architecture, becoming in old age the architect of the new St. Peter's Basilica. He wrote poetry, and he kept carving almost to the end. His last works, left unfinished, were sculptures he was still shaping just days before his death in Rome in 1564 at the age of 88. He was the first Western artist whose biography was written and published in his own lifetime, a measure of how completely his contemporaries knew they were living alongside genius. Let that thought settle softly. An old man in a quiet workshop, chisel in hand, still trying after 70 years to set free the figure waiting in the stone. Chapter 9. Raphael and the Perfect Harmony. The third of the great masters of this golden moment came later than the others and lived the shortest life of all, and yet in his brief years he achieved a kind of serene perfection that has made his name a synonym for grace. Raphael, in Italian, Raffaello Sanzio, was born in 1483 in the small but cultured city of Urbino, where his father was a painter at the refined court of the local duke. He grew up surrounded by art and learning, and perhaps that gentle upbringing left its mark on everything he made. His short career moved through 3 clear chapters. He learned his first lessons in his native Umbria, under the painter Perugino, whose soft, balanced style he absorbed and then surpassed. Around 1504 he came to Florence, where he studied closely the 2 masters transforming art before his eyes. From Leonardo, he learned the subtle play of light and the gentle turning of figures. From Michelangelo, the power and structure of the human body. He took what he learned and made it wholly his own, blending these influences into something clear, calm, and balanced, flowing with an apparently effortless harmony. And then, in 1508, came the call that would define him. The same Pope Julius II, who had set Michelangelo to work on the Sistine ceiling, now summoned the young Raphael to Rome and gave him an extraordinary task: to decorate the very rooms of the papal apartments where the Pope lived and worked. These are known simply as the Raphael rooms, and he would spend the last 12 years of his life filling them with frescoes. The most celebrated of all these paintings is one of the supreme images of the entire Renaissance, the School of Athens. Imagine a vast, soaring hall of classical architecture, and gathered within it, all the greatest thinkers of the ancient world, brought together across the centuries into a single imagined conversation. At the very center stand the 2 giants of Greek philosophy, Plato, gesturing upward toward the realm of eternal ideas, and beside him Aristotle, his hand stretched out level toward the earth, toward the world that can be observed and known. Around them cluster mathematicians and astronomers and sages, each absorbed in thought. It is a painting about knowledge itself, a serene celebration of human reason and the long search for truth. And in a charming touch, Raphael painted the faces of his own contemporaries among the ancient thinkers. The architect Bramante appears as the geometer Euclid, and Plato himself, many have long believed, was given the face of Leonardo da Vinci, though we should hold that last identification gently as a much-repeated tradition rather than a proven fact. What makes Raphael's work feel like a summing up of the whole Renaissance is precisely this sense of harmony, the balance of his compositions, the clarity of his spaces, the grace of his figures. Where Leonardo dazzles us with mystery and Michelangelo overwhelms us with power, Raphael soothes us with a feeling of rightness, of everything settled into its proper place. His life ended suddenly and far too soon. He died in 1520 on the 6th of April, which by a poignant coincidence was also his birthday. He was just 37, and all of Rome mourned. Let his gentle gift rest with you now as you grow more drowsy. A young man who, in only a few short years, taught the world what serene and effortless beauty could look like, and then was gone, leaving behind a calm that has never quite faded. Chapter 10. Palaces, Churches, and Cathedrals. Let us turn now from painting to the great structures that rose around it, and to one building in particular that became the wonder of its age. While the painters were teaching the world to see the human body anew, the architects were rediscovering an ancient language of harmony and proportion. The medieval centuries had built their great cathedrals in the soaring Gothic style, all height and shadow and intricate stone tracery. But the Renaissance architects turned their eyes, as the scholars had, toward the ruins of ancient Rome. They measured those broken temples and arches with great care, and they found the secret of their beauty, they believed, in mathematics, in simple, clear proportions, in symmetry and balance. Beauty, they came to believe, arose from order. A building should be composed the way a piece of music is, with measured intervals and pleasing ratios, so that the whole felt calm, rational, and complete. The man who, more than any other, opened this path was a Florentine named Filippo Brunelleschi, born in 1377. He is also credited with working out the rules of linear perspective, the mathematical system by which painters could create a convincing illusion of depth on a flat surface, making all the lines of a scene appear to recede toward a single vanishing point, a discovery that would transform painting forever. But his greatest triumph was built. For more than a century, Florence had been raising an enormous cathedral, and at its center yawned an immense open space, a crossing wider than anything spanned in 1,000 years, and no one knew how to roof it. The plan called for a dome of unprecedented size, but the old methods would not serve, and to build the wooden framework that normally supported a dome would have required more timber than existed. For decades, the cathedral stood open to the sky. Brunelleschi solved it. Studying ancient Roman engineering and devising methods entirely his own, he built the dome without that vast supporting framework at all. He designed a dome of two shells, one nested inside the other, and laid the bricks in an ingenious herringbone pattern that allowed each ring to support itself as it rose. And ring by ring, year by year between 1420 and 1436, the great dome rose over Florence, broad and red and serene, crowning the city, visible for miles across the Tuscan hills. It remains the largest masonry dome ever built. The dome became a symbol of the city's pride, of the new confidence of the age, of what could be achieved when ancient wisdom met fresh invention. And it opened the way for a whole new architecture across Italy. Churches and palaces with columns and rounded arches, facades composed in measured intervals, interiors shaped by harmonious geometry. Thinkers like Leon Battista Alberti gave these ideas their theory, describing beauty as a harmony among parts so complete that nothing could be added or taken away without spoiling the whole. So picture that broad dome rising slowly over the rooftops, season by season, as the people of Florence watched it climb toward the sky. And let that sense of rising, settling order carry you a little deeper towards sleep. Chapter 11. The Life of an Artist. It is worth slowing down to picture how art was actually made in those days. The daily life of the workshop, the patient labor, the smell of pigment and oil. For the painter of the Renaissance was not at first the lone romantic genius we sometimes imagine. He was a craftsman, trained through years of apprenticeship, working in a busy shop alongside others. A boy might enter a master's workshop at 12 or 13, bound by an agreement that could last for years. At first, he did the humblest tasks, sweeping the floor, preparing the wooden panels, running errands. Then slowly, he was taught the craft itself, and much of that craft was patient preparation that came long before any brush touched a surface. For an artist could not simply buy his colors ready-made, he had to make them. Imagine the apprentice grinding pigments by hand, taking lumps of colored earth and mineral, and grinding them on a stone slab, finer and finer, into a smooth powder. Some colors came from common earths, others were rare and costly, almost beyond belief. The deep, glowing blue called ultramarine was made from a semi-precious stone carried all the way from distant mountains in Asia, so precious that contracts sometimes specified exactly how much of it a painter must use. These powders were mixed with a binding medium, egg yolk, in the older technique called tempera, or increasingly oil, a newer method that allowed colors to be blended slowly and richly, with soft transitions and deep, glowing shadows. Then there was the art of fresco, the painting of walls and ceilings, a craft of patience and nerve. The painter would spread only as much fresh, wet plaster as could be painted in a single day, then paint directly into it. As the plaster dried, the color bound permanently into the wall, fixed forever. But he had to work fast, before the plaster set, and could not correct a mistake once it had. It is humbling to think of the great fresco cycles, covering whole walls and ceilings, built up patch by patch by artists who could not afford a single careless stroke. And across the century, something shifted. As the great masters rose to fame, the status of the artist began to change. No longer merely a skilled manual worker, the celebrated painter came to be seen as something closer to what we would now call a genius, whose vision was prized in itself, and artists began to sign their works with new pride. The lone romantic genius we imagine was, in a sense, being slowly invented across these years, emerging from the busy, hard-working world of the workshop. So picture that workshop as you drift, the soft grinding of stone on stone, the smell of oil and egg and pigment, the wet sheen of fresh plaster, the patient hands. Let that calm industry settle around you like a warm room on a cold evening. Chapter 12. Music, Feasts, and Daily Entertainment. The Renaissance was not all solemn labor and lofty thought. It was also a world of music and feasting, of festivals and games. Let us spend a little while among them, for there are few things more soothing than to imagine, from a great distance, the warm sounds of an evening celebration long ago. Music ran through every level of this society. In the cathedrals, sacred choral music rose toward the vaults, and the composers of the age were exploring a rich new art called polyphony, in which several independent melodies were woven together at once, voice over voice, an art of order and proportion in sound, mirroring the same love of harmony the architects pursued in stone. To make music was a common grace, part of the education of any cultivated person. The great families knew how to celebrate in style. A banquet in a Renaissance palace was a feast for every sense. Long tables laden with roasted meats and sweet pastries, wine flowing freely, music and dancing between the courses, the great hall lit by countless candles. And there were great public celebrations too. The festivals of the religious calendar filled the squares with processions and music, and during carnival the ordinary rules of life loosened for a while, as masks appeared and performances spilled into the streets. Leisure took simpler forms as well: board games and stories around the hearth, the hunt for the nobles, ball games for the young, the taverns where working people gathered after their labor. And at the most refined courts, there grew up an entire ideal of how a cultivated person ought to behave, captured in the Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione, which taught that the truly accomplished person should make even difficult things look easy, wearing their learning lightly, without strain. So let us close this chapter inside one of those candlelit halls on an evening long ago. The feast is winding down. The lute is playing softly now, a slow and gentle air. The last sweet wine glows in the glasses. Outside, the city is dark and quiet. Inside, the warm light flickers on contented faces. The dancing has grown slow and dreamy. Voices have dropped to a murmur, and little by little the guests grow sleepy in the warmth and the music. Just as you are growing sleepy now, let that soft melody carry you onward, into the quiet. Chapter 13. The Invention of the Printing Press. While painters were transforming how Europe saw, another change, quieter at first, was transforming what Europe knew, and how that knowledge could spread. Its consequences would be greater perhaps than those of any painting. It was the invention of printing with movable type. To feel the weight of this change, remember how books had been made before. Every book was copied out by hand, line by line, by a scribe bent over a desk. To produce a single Bible might take a skilled copyist the better part of a year. Books were therefore rare and astonishingly expensive, possessions of the church, of universities, of the very wealthy. Most people never owned a book at all. Knowledge moved slowly through such a world, and with every fresh copying, small errors crept in and multiplied. The man who changed this was Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith of the German city of Mainz, born around the year 1400. He did not invent printing from nothing. Forms of it had existed earlier in China and Korea, but he brought together in a single practical system the elements that made the mass production of books possible in Europe. Individual letters cast in metal that could be arranged into pages, inked, pressed onto paper, then taken apart and rearranged. An oily ink that would cling to the type, and a screw press of the kind already used for crushing grapes. Around the year 1455, he completed his masterpiece, a magnificent Bible printed with 42 lines to each page, in type so elegant it could be mistaken at a glance for fine handwriting. A printed Bible still cost a great deal, but far less than a hand-copied one, and many identical copies could be made in the time it had once taken to make a single manuscript. There is a poignant human story tangled up in this triumph. Gutenberg had borrowed heavily to fund his work, and just as the great Bible was being completed, his creditor sued him, won the case, and took possession of the workshop. Gutenberg, the man whose invention would reshape the world, was left effectively bankrupt and died years later in relative obscurity, never truly celebrated in his own lifetime for the astonishing thing he had made. And what he set in motion spread with breathtaking speed. Within a few decades, printing presses had sprung up in hundreds of towns across Europe, and by the year 1500, less than 50 years after Gutenberg's Bible, the number of books had multiplied from thousands into millions. The recovered treasures of the ancient world could now be printed and distributed everywhere, so that a discovery made in one city could be read across the whole continent within months. And books began to appear not only in Latin, but in the everyday spoken languages, reaching readers who had never known the old, learned tongue. Knowledge, in short, had been set loose. The quiet craftsman in Mainz, ruined by his own creation, had handed the world a key. Let that thought rest gently with you. The soft clatter of the press, the fresh ink on the page, and ideas drifting outward across the whole of Europe like seeds carried on the wind. Chapter 14: Explorers and the Sea. In the same decades that books were multiplying, the physical world itself was growing larger in the European imagination. For this was also the age when European ships began to venture out across the open oceans toward horizons no European had ever crossed. It is sometimes called the Age of Discovery, though we should remember that the lands these sailors reached were not empty, and that for the peoples already living there, the arrival of European ships would bring consequences both profound and often terrible. But the voyages themselves transformed forever how Europe understood the shape of the world. Why did they go? The reasons were tangled together: the lure of trade, above all the desire to reach the rich markets of Asia directly by sea, bypassing the long overland routes and the many middlemen between Europe and the spices and silks of the East, for spices were worth more than their weight in gold. The hunger for wealth and new lands, missionary zeal, and something of the Renaissance spirit itself, a restless curiosity, a confidence that the world could be explored and known. The Portuguese led the way. Through the first half of the 15th century, encouraged by a prince remembered as Henry the Navigator, their ships pushed cautiously down the western coast of Africa, a little farther with each expedition, perfecting a nimble new kind of ship well suited to ocean travel. In 1488, a captain named Bartolomeo Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa, and in 1498, Vasco da Gama completed the dream, sailing all the way around Africa to reach India itself, opening at last a direct sea route between Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, a Genoese sailor in the service of Spain had a bolder idea. His name was Christopher Columbus, and he believed he could reach the riches of Asia by sailing west, straight across the Atlantic. Most learned men thought he had badly underestimated the distance, and in fact he had. But in 1492, funded by Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon, he set out with 3 small ships, and after weeks at sea, sighted land. He was convinced he had reached the outskirts of Asia. In truth, he had stumbled upon a whole hemisphere unknown to Europe, and he died still believing he had found a westward route to the Indies. The new lands would take their name not from him, but from another Italian navigator, Amerigo Vespucci, who recognized them as a new world. What followed changed the planet. Spanish expeditions pressed into the Americas, and conquerors overthrew the great indigenous empires of Mexico and Peru. A conquest made possible as much by the diseases the Europeans unknowingly carried, against which the native peoples had no defense, as by their weapons. In 1519, an expedition led by Ferdinand Magellan set out to sail around the world. Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines, but one of his ships completed the first circumnavigation of the globe in 1522. And across the oceans now flowed a great exchange of life itself. From the Americas came new foods that would transform the diets of the old world: the potato, maize, the tomato, while from Europe went horses and wheat, and tragically, the diseases that ravaged the Americas. The old maps, drawn from the wisdom of the ancients, were now revealed to be incomplete, a profound lesson reaching far beyond geography. If the revered ancients could be wrong about the very shape of the earth, then perhaps inherited knowledge of every kind might be tested against fresh observation and found wanting. The expanding world fed the expanding mind. So picture those small wooden ships, far out on the immense and empty ocean, their sails filled with wind, their crews steering by sun and star toward lands they could not yet imagine. And let that vast, calm ocean carry you onward, rocking you gently toward sleep. Chapter 15: Science and Curiosity. The same spirit that sent ships across the oceans was also turning its gaze upward, to the heavens, and inward, to the workings of the human body. For the Renaissance in its later years gave rise to a new way of seeking knowledge, founded not only on the authority of ancient texts, but on careful observation, on measurement, on looking at the world directly and trusting what one saw. It would, in time, grow into what we now call the scientific revolution. But its roots lay in the Renaissance habit of questioning inherited wisdom and observing nature with patient attention. Consider the heavens first. For more than 1,000 years, Europeans had understood the cosmos through a model handed down from the ancient astronomer Ptolemy, in which the Earth sat motionless at the very center of everything, while around it turned the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars. It was woven deeply into how people understood their place in creation and carried the weight of 1,000 years of authority. But it never quite fitted the observed motions of the planets, and a few careful minds had begun to wonder. One was a quiet Polish scholar named Nicholas Copernicus, born in 1473, who had studied in Italy. After many years of patient calculation, he reached a startling conclusion, that the old model became far simpler if one assumed the sun, not the Earth, stood at the center, and that the Earth was merely one of the planets, turning daily on its axis and circling the sun once a year. He laid out this idea in a great book published in 1543, in the very year of his death, having hesitated long before publishing, for it unsettled both the science and the faith of his age. At first, it circulated mostly among specialists. Its full revolutionary force would be felt only by later generations. In that very same year, 1543, another book quietly transformed a different field. A young anatomist named Andreas Vesalius published a magnificently illustrated study of the human body, based not on the old texts, but on his own careful dissections. For centuries, the understanding of human anatomy had rested on the writings of the ancient physician Galen. But Galen had largely dissected animals, and his descriptions contained errors trusted for over 1,000 years. Vesalius, looking with his own eyes at the body itself, corrected those errors, and in doing so announced a principle that would prove revolutionary, that direct observation could overturn even the most revered ancient authority. As the decades passed, this new spirit gathered strength. The Danish nobleman Tycho Brahe recorded the positions of the stars with extraordinary precision and observed a new star blazing in the sky in 1572, a thing that should have been impossible if the heavens were truly perfect and unchanging, and which suggested instead that the cosmos itself might alter and evolve. Later, in the early 17th century, the Italian Galileo Galilei would turn a newly improved telescope toward the night sky and see things no human eye had ever seen. Mountains on the moon, moons circling Jupiter, the changing phases of Venus, observations that powerfully supported the idea that the Earth was not the unmoving center of all things, and which would bring him into painful conflict with the authorities of the Church. What united all these labors was a habit of mind, the willingness to observe carefully, to measure, and to revise even the most ancient teachings when the world itself said otherwise. For most of these thinkers, this curiosity did not feel like a war against faith. Many were devout, and saw in the study of nature a way of understanding its creator more deeply. But beneath it all, a new confidence was taking hold, that human beings, by looking and reasoning, could come to understand the workings of the world. The cosmos was beginning to seem less a fixed and finished thing, and more an open question, vast and waiting to be explored. So picture the patient astronomer at his instrument, under the cold, clear night sky, charting the slow wheeling of the stars, the long, quiet labor of looking closely at the world and writing down, faithfully, exactly what is there. Let that calm, attentive curiosity settle over you and carry you toward rest. Chapter 16. The Renaissance in Northern Europe. For all that we have spoken of Italy, the Renaissance did not remain forever an Italian affair. Slowly, along the trade routes and through the pages of printed books, the new spirit moved northward, into the Low Countries and Germany, into France and England, where it met older traditions and was changed by them. The Renaissance of the North would have a different flavor, often more inward, more detailed, more deeply concerned with religion and the texture of ordinary life. But it sprang from the same root. In the prosperous cities of the Low Countries, wealth from trade supported a flowering of art quite distinct from Italy's. Where Italian painters pursued ideal beauty and classical proportion, the northern masters pursued a patient, loving realism, an attention to surface and detail so fine it can take the breath away, made possible by their mastery of oil paint. The painter Jan van Eyck could render the gleam of metal, the pile of velvet, the glint of light in a mirror, with a precision that seemed almost magical, and the German artist Albrecht Dürer journeyed into Italy, studied its science of perspective, and carried that knowledge home, fusing southern structure with northern detail, working, crucially, in the new art of printmaking, so that his images could be reproduced and carried across the continent. But perhaps the deepest expression of the Northern Renaissance was in the life of the mind. And here one figure stands above the rest. Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, born around 1466, in his own day perhaps the most famous scholar in all of Europe. Erasmus embodied what we call Christian humanism. He had drunk deeply from the humanist wells of Italy, and he turned that learning toward the renewal of the Christian faith. Like the Italian humanists, he believed in returning to the original sources, and for Erasmus, the most important source of all was the Bible itself. He labored to prepare a careful new edition of the New Testament in its original Greek, so that Scripture might be studied afresh, free of the errors accumulated over centuries of copying. He longed to reform the church gently, from within, to call it back to a simpler, more heartfelt Christianity, rooted in Scripture and inner piety, rather than empty ritual. There were others, too, like Thomas More in England, Erasmus's friend, whose book Utopia imagined a far-off island society organized by reason and held up as a mirror to the failings of his own world. But there is a quiet irony at the heart of Erasmus's story, and it carries us toward the great upheaval that was coming. For all his longing to reform the church gently, the forces he helped to stir, his call to return to the Scriptures, his sharp criticisms of corruption, his new Greek New Testament would soon break far beyond anything he intended, helping to prepare the ground for a storm that would split Christendom in two. For now, let us rest in the gentler image. The great scholar at his desk, surrounded by his books and letters, dreaming of a world made better through learning and faith and quiet goodwill. Let that hopeful, peaceable image settle softly over you. Chapter 17. Kings, Courts, and Power. As the Renaissance spread northward, it entered a different political world. Italy had been a land of city-states and republics, but much of the rest of Europe was organizing itself in these very years into large and increasingly powerful kingdoms, ruled by monarchs whose authority was steadily growing. And these kings and queens, seeing the brilliance of the Italian courts, wished to draw that brilliance to themselves, to make their own courts shine with art and learning as symbols of their power and magnificence. In France, the king Francis I became a great admirer and importer of the Italian Renaissance. It was he who invited the aging Leonardo to spend his final years in France, and who brought Italian artists and architects across the Alps. Under his influence, the French built magnificent chateaux, grand country palaces, that blended the new classical style of Italy with the traditions of France. In Spain, the Renaissance arrived amid a great national ascendancy, as the wealth pouring in from the new American empire funded art, learning, and grand building. And in England, the new spirit came more gradually, but it came. In the long reign of Elizabeth I, the royal court presided over a remarkable cultural flowering. It was in this Elizabethan England that the playwright William Shakespeare would weave classical themes and Renaissance ideas into dramas written in the everyday English tongue, exploring the depths of human character with a richness never surpassed. The Renaissance interest in the individual, in the inner life, found in him perhaps its supreme artistic expression. To live at one of these great courts was to inhabit a world of dazzling ceremony, palaces hung with tapestries, gardens laid out with geometric precision, banquets and masques and processions, all designed to surround the monarch with an aura of splendor. Art itself became an instrument of power. A grand portrait could project royal dignity, a magnificent building could announce a dynasty's strength. The model the Medici had pioneered in Florence, using cultural magnificence to reinforce political authority, was now adopted by the kings and queens of the great nations on an ever grander scale. And as these monarchies grew, so did the machinery of governing them, and with it a new kind of thinking about power itself, most famously in the work of the Florentine Niccolò Machiavelli, who wrote with cool and unsettling clarity about how rulers actually win and keep authority, examining power as it is rather than as it ought to be. So picture those glittering courts as you drift deeper now. The great halls ablaze with candlelight, the monarchs surrounded by beauty as by a kind of armor, the elegant chateau rising above the French rivers. Let that distant magnificence soften into a warm and golden haze and rest there. Chapter 18, The Reformation and a Changing Europe. And now we come to the great storm, the upheaval that would, more than anything else, bring the classical age of the Renaissance toward its close and carry Europe into a new and more turbulent era. It was a storm in the world of religion, and it would split the unity of Western Christendom forever. We call it the Reformation. For all the long centuries we have traveled through, Western Europe had shared a single church, centered on Rome, binding the whole of the West into one vast community of faith. By the early 16th century, though, many devout people were troubled by what they saw as corruption and worldliness in the church, and above all by certain practices that seemed to make a mockery of true faith. One such was the selling of indulgences, documents that, it was claimed, could reduce the punishment for sins. To many sincere believers, the selling of forgiveness for money seemed a grievous wrong. Among those troubled was a German monk and professor of theology named Martin Luther, who taught at the University of Wittenberg. Luther was tormented by deep questions about sin and salvation, and had come, through his study of Scripture, to a powerful conviction that a person is saved not by good works or purchased pardons, but by faith alone through the grace of God. When an aggressive campaign to sell indulgences came near his region, his conscience rebelled. In the autumn of 1517, on the 31st of October by long tradition, though some historians question the details of the famous scene, he set out 95 points for debate, the 95 Theses, challenging the practice of indulgences. He may, as the old story tells, have posted them upon the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, or he may simply have sent them to his superiors. But what happened next owed everything to an invention we have already met. Luther's words did not stay in Wittenberg. Thanks to the printing press, they were copied, printed, and carried across Germany and beyond within weeks. A local academic dispute transformed almost overnight into a continental controversy. Here, the two great forces of the age met and amplified one another: the religious yearning for reform and the new power of print to spread ideas faster than any authority could contain them. Condemned by the Pope and summoned before the Emperor, Luther refused to recant, and the breach widened into a permanent rupture. He translated the New Testament into German, using, as it happened, the Greek edition Erasmus had prepared, so that ordinary people might read the scriptures for themselves. The movement spread and divided. In Switzerland, other reformers arose, among them John Calvin, whose stern theology would shape Protestant communities across Europe. In England, King Henry VIII broke with Rome and established a national church under royal authority. The single church of the West had shattered into many. The Roman Catholic Church responded with a great movement of reform and renewal of its own, clarifying its doctrine, addressing the abuses that had given the reformers their cause, and founding new religious orders devoted to education and missionary work. But the divisions also brought terrible wars of religion that would tear at the continent for generations. And in all of this, we can see the Renaissance both completing itself and passing away. For the Reformation grew, in a sense, out of the very spirit of the Renaissance, out of the humanist call to return to the original sources, out of the printing press, out of the willingness to question inherited authority. And yet the upheaval it unleashed also brought to an end the serene confidence of the High Renaissance, that bright moment when art and learning had seemed to flower in harmony. The world that emerged was more divided, more anxious, more modern. So let us hold this turbulent chapter gently, as one holds the memory of a storm seen from a safe and quiet room. The old unity breaking, the printed words flying across the continent, and beneath it all the same human longing for truth and grace that had driven the scholars to their forgotten books. Let it soften into the distance now, growing quieter as you drift further toward sleep. Chapter 19. What the Renaissance left to the world. We have traveled a long way together tonight, from the plague-shadowed world of the 14th century, through the glittering cities of Italy, into the workshops and libraries, across the oceans and up toward the stars, and through the great storm of religious change. As our journey nears its end, let us look back gently and ask what the Renaissance truly left behind, for its gifts are with us still, woven so deeply into our world that we scarcely notice them. Think first of how much had changed. In the year 1300, most Europeans lived in small rural villages, governed by feudal obligation, their minds shaped almost entirely by the authority of the church, their knowledge carried in rare handwritten books. By the year 1700, Europe contained large and organized states, cities linked by trade across the whole globe, printed books in their millions, and institutions devoted to the systematic study of the natural world. The transformation had been gradual, built from countless small decisions by countless ordinary people, but its sum was a different world. Perhaps the deepest change of all was a change in how people understood knowledge itself. The Renaissance taught Europe to return to original sources, to compare and to question, to trust observation alongside inherited authority. That habit, once learned, could not be unlearned. It began with the recovery of ancient texts. It extended to the fresh reading of scripture. It grew at last into the careful observation of nature that would become modern science. Think, too, of the legacy in art, the techniques of perspective, anatomy, and harmonious composition that became the foundations of Western art for centuries, and the works themselves, still drawing crowds in the great museums of the world. Think of the humanist ideal of education, that a cultivated person should read widely and reason clearly, which shaped European schooling for generations and echoes in our own ideas still. And think of the change in how people saw themselves, the new weight given to the individual, and the new sense of standing in time, looking back across the centuries to an ancient past and forward toward an unknown future. It is worth remembering that the people who lived through all this did not know they were living in a renaissance. That name came later. The word means rebirth, applied to the age by those looking back, who recognized that something lasting had shifted between the 14th century and the 17th. The men and women of the time simply lived their lives, never suspecting that later generations would gather their scattered efforts under a single shining name. Nor was it a clean break with the past. Faith remained central to most lives, old hierarchies endured, and most people still followed the ancient rhythms of the land. The Renaissance was less a sudden dawn than a slow turning of attention, toward the classical past, toward human experience, toward the careful observation of the world. But that slow turning changed everything that followed, carrying Europe out of the medieval inheritance and toward the modern age. This, then, is what the Renaissance left to the world. Not only its paintings and its palaces, its poems and its discoveries, but a whole new orientation of the mind. The expectation that texts may be questioned, that nature may be measured, that the past may teach us and the future may be shaped. It embedded these habits in lasting institutions, schools and universities, printing houses and libraries, so that they would outlast any individual and pass quietly down through the generations, all the way to us. Let that long inheritance settle over you now, like a soft blanket drawn up at the end of a long day, the sense of standing at the end of a great chain of patient effort, reaching back to those who first dared to look at the world with fresh and curious eyes. And so we come, gently, to the end of our long journey. Let us return, one last time, to where so much of our story began, to the city of Florence, in the soft light of evening, as the sun goes down over the rooftops and the river. Imagine that you are walking slowly through the streets of Florence at the close of a long golden day. The light is turning amber now, then rose, slanting low between the buildings, gilding the stone. The day's work is finishing, the market's growing quiet, and somewhere, faintly, a lute is being played. Walk on, unhurried, through the narrowing light. There ahead of you rises the great dome of the cathedral, Brunelleschi's dome, broad and serene against the deepening sky, catching the very last of the sun on its curving tiles. And as you gaze up at it, the bells begin to ring for evening, slow, deep, resonant, the sound rolling out over the rooftops and the hills beyond. The same bells that have marked the hours of this city through all the long years of our story. Think, for a quiet moment, of everything those bells have witnessed. The scholars bent over forgotten books, waking the voices of the ancient dead. The painters in their workshops, teaching figures how to stand and grieve and breathe. Leonardo with his endless notebooks. Michelangelo high on his scaffold. Raphael with his serene and graceful hand. The dome rising ring by ring, the printed pages flying out across the continent. The ships setting out toward unknown seas. 300 years of patient change, of curiosity and craft and quiet courage, all of it gathered now into the soft ringing of evening bells over a darkening city. The sun sinks lower. The amber light fades toward blue, and then toward the first soft gray of dusk. Lamps are lit, one by one, golden points of warmth in the gathering dark, and the great dome becomes a silhouette against the last pale glow on the horizon. The city is settling as all cities settle into the deep quiet of the night. History does not sleep, it is sometimes said, but it does grow still. And tonight, we may let it grow still. Let the courts and the workshops, the printing presses and the harbors, the scholars and the painters and the kings, all grow soft and quiet and far away, and gently take our leave of them, with gratitude. Let your thoughts drift one last time across the domes and the rivers, the long, slow arc of all that change, and then let even those images soften and blur and fade, the way the streets of Florence are fading now into the blue of evening. There is nothing more to do, nothing more to follow, nothing more to hold. The story is told. The bells have rung. The light is nearly gone. So let the Renaissance fade quietly into the dusk, like a city settling into night. Let your breathing slow. Let your body grow heavy and warm and still. Let the last of the day's thoughts loosen and drift away, like leaves on a slow, dark river, carried gently out of sight. Rest now. The journey is over, and you are exactly where you need to be. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are, and until next time, sweet dreams.